Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Outside the Box. And for those of you who have been with us for the last year or two, we've got a familiar face, a familiar voice with us today. I like to refer to you, Dr. Ryce, as a healer. You're a teacher. You're a lecturer on the subject. Guys, I'm with Dr. Michael Ryce. Dr. Ryce, how's it going, man?
It's rocking. It's doing well, and actually, for my mind, the root of the word education is educare, which means to draw out or to lead out. So mostly, as opposed to a teacher, which our culture I think tends to be, well, we're going to fill your mind with something you don't have. What my work is really about is the wholeness is already inside of each one of us. If it's restricted, if it's shut down, whether it's from blood flow, fear, rage, whatever it is, then it's hard to come forward through our physiology as who we really are. And so all of the work that I've done over the last 50 years, and then a couple of years ago, the AVACEN came along, and it does what I'd been working to do with the mind, with the emotions, with the awareness of who we are. It does that physiologically. So you've got reinforcement on a physiological level. So education, educare, draw out, bring out who we really are.
You know, Dr. Ryce, I knew you were going to start off with something that just kind of blew my mind, as you have in our previous couple of conversations, which what we'll do is we'll make sure we link those conversations in the description, whether that's on YouTube or any of the audio platforms. We've spoken about forgiveness. We've spoken about, the AVACEN a little bit, which we're going to focus on more on today. I love what you said there, just about teaching is more about almost like an unlocking process. It's a process of bringing things forward and out. And is that kind of what I just heard there?
Well, I would see the word educate being more that I just listened again this morning to our last interview where we talked about the forgiveness process. And I had decided to start out with a quote, and with the direction we're heading, this quote will still fit. And it actually comes from a piece of research that was done by the CIA, interestingly enough. And here's what they did: a research project. And there's actually a book on our website that they publish. You can get it from their website, but they keep moving the link around. So we've actually placed it on our Why Again site too. It's called The Study of Human Intelligence. And one chapter in that book, they studied perception and what perception is. And of course, their objective is, we have these agents all over the world and we're trying to get the best feedback we can get from them. So here's what they say. Perception is a demonstrably active rather than passive process. It constructs rather than records reality. People continuously construct their own version of reality. So to me, teaching usually is teaching to the construct that somebody has in their mind. Okay, you have a belief system, your mind constructs your world a certain way, and I'm going to put more information in that because of course, you don't know, and I do, so I'll put it in for you. Where education says, beneath and behind that is a whole world that perception never grasps because of the closing down of the system. There's an interesting piece, we talked about this in our last session, there's an interesting piece of research from Harvard University. It's actually the most quoted research. It's been around for over 50 years in psychological research ever. And basically what it says is that in a time frame where there are 10,000 measurable units of electrical activity happening in the brain, literally they've hooked electrodes up and measured it, that in that time frame, which is about a 25th of a second, the max amount of data that comes into conscious awareness, our perceptual construct, is 9 bits. Tiny, tiny little piece. And if you remember, we talked about the key to that, the forgiveness, is how to change that process. And so my offering is that if you look at, there are 10,000 bits of data moving, and something selects out 9 bits, and that's the world we see. And of course, if you select one 9-bit chunk of information, I select another, we can go to war over it because I look at something and I say, no, it's this. And you say, no, it's that. And I want it to be this way and you want it to be that way. And we can literally People go to war over those things. Underneath that, there's a whole other world. And it's a world that's based in active present love. It's a world of light. If you talk to the physicist tells us that matter is light energy slowed down to form. Einstein says, on such things as matter, we have been all wrong. What we have heretofore called matter is energy whose vibrations have been so low as to be perceptible to the senses. There is no matter, says Einstein. Our mind says, no, I live in a material world. Now, maybe, somebody knows better than Einstein. I don't think I can stand up to him. He said there's no matter. When you recognize that, then our perception shows us a world of solidified form. And to do that, we have to have solidified that within our own individual energy systems. So the mind becomes a reducing valve. Forgiveness, as the core of my work, is opening the reducing valve so that we get to see more of what the actuality holds. And what the AVACEN does, where when you think about 10,000 bits of data firing restricted to 9 bits, that's a lot of restriction. That's a lot of shutting down. What the AVACEN does literally is restore blood flow, open up blood flow to the whole system, because where there's restriction, there's disease. Literally, not an entity out there, a horrible virus or bug that's out to get us, but a dis-ease, a lack of ease, because there's an energy locked in the structure that doesn't belong here. And the energy that most people get locked into that restricts that flow is hostility and fear. Fear, fright, and freeze. And that's called, in medicine, sympathetic dominance. It literally, if a lion's chasing you, you certainly don't need to reproduce. You don't need the spleen to work to build new blood cells. You don't need your bowel to work. You don't need to eliminate. Man doesn't need to produce sperm. Woman doesn't need to produce egg. Hey, there's a lion chasing me. We don't need energy for all that. We don't need higher cortical functions. So blood flow is cut off to all of those things to move into sympathetic dominance, which shunts that blood into the larger muscles in order to enable us, to empower us to fight or run. And it opens, the other flow comes to the lungs, and we get an opening so we can take in more oxygen, supply more oxygen, and be more efficient at defending ourselves or running away. And that restriction is an awesome function because it's survival.
Yep.
But if that becomes chronic, people are in big trouble. People who live in hostility and fear. And I was just reading some information the other day, and they were talking about assaults on children. Then they did some research on 8 different forms of assault. And something like 60% of people in this country have had one or more of those forms of assaults happen within their childhood. And when those things are set into activity, people go into restriction, fear, and oftentimes, people will look at the kid and say, well, just do something. And the kid's like, well, why don't you, what's wrong with you? You can't do. Hey, the brain just went into freeze mode. That's survival. The possum rolls over and plays dead, and it's survival. Freeze is a place that can mean survival. But if we impinge on the child, fear, rage, anger, and that locks into tissue, in the future, that child's mind and that child's physiology 50 years later can't tell the difference between that being re-triggered into activity and being a present moment experience and what happened when one was 4, and they made all kinds of judgments that caused restriction for survival reasons. But now, when the threat no longer exists, if that shutdown's still there, there's big trouble, because literally intelligence is reduced. Literally, the brain flow to higher cortical functions is cut off. One of the things the AVACEN does is restore that flow. Blood flow to, the sympathetic dominance is that survival. Parasympathetic, the opposite, or the opposite end of the spectrum. They're really one and the same. It's kind of like a slider on your fancy stereo. You put it on one side and it quiets things down, and you turn it way up and it's extra loud. It's a continuum. And if we live on that sympathetic side because we've got a boss that resonates what dad used to do when he used to whip on me, then I'm right back being 3 years old in that same physiological state. What the AVACEN does, and there's a set of muscle fibers at the head of each of 40 to 60 billion capillaries. They talk about people being uptight. What's the uptight person look like? Shoulders are hunched, yep. Heads forward, protection, looking for, what's going to attack, all sorts of things. And in the extreme, what's the old man look like? The old woman? Everything shuts down, folds down to protect the heart, to protect the vital organs. But if there's no threat, that's death, because we're cut off from the ability to thrive, to regenerate, to rest properly, to digest properly, to reproduce. You look at the number of people who have digestive issues. You look at the number of people who, it's skyrocketed, the number of people who can't get pregnant. Mm. And that's all related to sympathetic dominance. What the AVACEN does by applying heat through the palm of the hand to the whole body supply of blood, when blood goes into the hand and flows through the hand and then returns to the body, within 3 minutes, it's back in the hand. So once one puts one's hand in the AVACEN where the palm of the hand has heat applied to it, and there's a vacuum that distends the blood vessels. The vacuum causes the blood vessels in the hand to expand so more heat can be poured into it. 3 times around in the body, so in about 10 minutes, literally, the whole blood supply in the body is heated by a little less than 1 degree. And that just makes monumental changes in biochemistry. And at the head of each capillary, there's a set of muscle fibers. And those muscle fibers are called the precapillary orifice, are open to allow blood to flow in and supply the cells. Or if there's a threat, cut off the blood supply, those muscles tighten, lock up, people become uptight who are in that state chronically, and those muscle fibers close to inhibit blood flow so that if injury occurs, people don't bleed to death. It's a survival mechanism. Right. But we don't want to live in survival mode. So people who've habituated survival all their lives put their hand in the AVACEN, and over time, they get into a thing. There was a book written a few years ago by a fellow named Herbert Benson, who was a heart specialist. It's called The Relaxation Response. Basically, and his method for achieving that was basically through meditation. And in today's world, a lot of people aren't going to stop and do that, but they can, even while they're sitting working on the computer, or they're sitting watching TV, or they're lying in bed. They can put their hand in the AVACEN, and over time, the body will start to habituate that relaxation response. Those muscle fibers, when you pour warm blood over them, soften and open. Restores blood flow to the thrive, rest, and digest parts of the system, to the higher functions in the brain, and everything changes when you do that. And that's basically the function of the AVACEN.
That's fascinating. One word came up in my head as you were speaking about how this whole process works, and it's regenerative. And the reason I say regenerative is because that's a kind of a hot word in medicine right now, regenerative medicine. And there's there's stem cell, there's PRP, things like that. But what you're saying, because I'm seeing this as a form of regeneration, you put your hand in the AVACEN. So for the people who have not seen one of these devices, you put your hand in, you're in a glove, and it like Dr. Ryce says, it's a vacuum type thing, and it heats the palm of your hand, which heats your blood. And I'm if I'm wrong, Dr. Ryce, I'm speaking in complete layman's terms here. It's heating your blood, and then what you're saying is that blood, that heated blood, is going to circulate throughout my entire body 3 times over the course of 10 minutes. Is that it? So now that's, to me, that's like a healing mechanism that's happening while my hand's in this through my palm. Is there a reason why it's the palm? Out of curiosity.
Yes. Yeah. Well, first of all, the device is about the size of a bread box. On
Okay.
one end, there's an opening for your hand to go in. There's a specially designed plastic mitt. It's a patented mitt. The AVACEN has an onboard computer that has about 4,000 different instructions. So when you start the machine, you'll hear it ticking away. You'll hear that, and it's continually adjusting the vacuum. And the reason why the hand, there are two places in the body that there's what's called the AVA, arteriovenous anastomosis. It's a heat exchanger. It's a radiator, basically. You'll notice if it's hot at night, what do? You stick your foot out from under the blanket and you cool down. How does that work? Well, you've actually got a little radiator in your foot. You've got radiators in your hands. Easier to do the hands than the feet. You'll notice that if you're cold, you spontaneously rub your hands together.
Yep.
What happens? You generate heat. The heat is absorbed into that AVA in the hand and is distributed throughout the whole body. So you're literally warming all the blood in your body when you do this. Or the other side of the equation, you get frustrated, you get hot, you get overheated, and what happens? Your palms sweat. That's the AVA throwing off heat. So you've got a way into the bloodstream through the palm of the hand.
Okay.
I can remember when a friend of mine who's a naturopath who introduced me to the AVACEN was telling me about what it does and how it works. It's like, well, why should I buy an AVACEN? I'll just go get myself a bucket of water, put my hand in hot water. Well, except that the body is always searching for homeostasis, which means that if I put my hand in a bucket of hot water and my body says, okay, enough, it'll shut down that radiator and no more heat will enter the bloodstream. There's one body hack that the AVACEN does, and that is when you put your hand in the machine and you start it, you've got this glove on, and it creates a vacuum around your hand. That distends the blood vessels, and now the AVA can't shut down.
Okay.
So you can continuously pour heat into the bloodstream through the palm of the hand. So one of the mechanisms of action is to open those capillary heads. Once the warmed blood flows over the capillary head, it opens, and now you've got, instead of uptight, you've got the relaxation response.
Can you? Why does that happen? So explain how so you're avoiding homeostasis, and you're heating up the blood. How does that activate the relaxation thing? Because I think that's a big deal, a big part of this, because you're talking parasympathetic, sympathetic.
Right.
What's happening there?
Sure. Well, let's do it experientially. Let's go in the opposite direction.
Okay.
Let yourself take a couple of deep breaths and just be relaxed. And imagine you're at home and you're in a really sweet space. You know, you just had a good meal. Things are feeling great. You're breathing beautifully and everything is just sweet. Mm. And you hear a noise in the background that to your mind interprets as threat and imminent danger.
Yeah.
Do that. You just went from the relaxation response to sympathetic dominance.
Right. I can feel tension.
Yeah, you can feel tension. And I mean, for me, when I do it, I can actually feel my body want to rise up, like I'm going into action here.
Right. Right.
So most people, or people who, you know, those 60% or so especially, who have had 1 to 8 different forms of abuse in childhood, live in that state continuously. You know, it's been labeled as a disorder, ADHD. Oh, this child can't focus on learning. Why do you think that is? This child is so threatened that it has to be hypervigilant to make sure that the next attack that's coming, it's got a way to handle it, to duck and get out of the way. So it lives in that tension state. Of course, there's no attention for learning in that state. And so when one goes into that tension place, there's this lockup, and the primary lockup that happens is in the capillaries that supply parasympathetic nervous system. The opening is to the sympathetic.
Okay.
And so if that's closed up, we've got somebody who's uptight. Literally, billions of muscle fibers at the headwaters of each capillary are in tension. They're locked up. And there's not blood flow to those parts of the structure. And if that happens long term, you know, I use the example in that other video I was telling you about. Imagine we've got a beautiful flowing stream, beautiful, clean, cold, clear water, and a tree falls over the stream. And the branches block up the stream,
Right.
and debris catches. And over a period of a couple of months, you've got a swamp. Now you've got smelly things growing there that were never growing in the stream. They were always in the stream, just like the so-called decay bacteria are always in our bodies, but they never multiplied because it was never an environment for them to multiply in. And so if one lives in that state and those capillary heads are closed down, what happens? You've got congestion now. And where there's congestion, you end up with a food supply for organisms that aren't supposed to multiply there. They aren't supposed to go out of balance. And then, of course, if you add the SAD diet, the standard American diet, where people eat the crap oils, the food that is basically nutrition free, one of the things we've been doing here the last 4 years, we've been living in Bristol, Virginia. My father-in-law became ill, couldn't live on his own. We decided to just come and take care of him. We've been developing gardens. And one of the things that I've realized that we have a teaching center called Heartland. And when we do an intensive there, we do total fresh and raw food. We don't cook anything. Everything is as organic as we can get it, and it's fresh and raw. And that's part of what we teach people to do, go into the kitchen and get their hands on real, actual food. And we used to grow food at Heartland. We actually haven't opened since 2019 because of COVID. We used to grow food there, but I never personally got my hands in the soil. But since we've been here, we actually, the house we're on has been here 60 or more years, and it sits on a hill that's just a chunk of clay and had a lawn on top of it, no soil. And so I started doing some study of that and started building soil. And one of the things that's become very clear to me is you can't grow food on dirt. And it's very similar with the microbiome of the body. You can't grow food on dirt. And most of our commercially produced food, one of the first things they do is they spray 10 gallons of glyphosate on every acre of land to make sure everything in the dirt, because now it's not soil anymore, it's dirt, is totally and completely dead. And then they want us to believe that if you put seeds in there, you'll actually get life from that death. I'm working an article called Healing from the Ground Up, and you've got to start your healing process from the soil.
Interesting.
It has to have life in it. It has to have a microbiome in order to grow actual food. The other stuff looks like food because it's been chemically manipulated and sprayed and bug killed and toxified. And it, kind of looks like food. But, 4 years ago, we got our first crops of tomato here. I hadn't tasted a tomato like this in 30 years. It's like, oh, this thing actually has flavor. It's not one of those rubber balls you get at the grocery store that's grown on dirt and has no actual nutrition, because in order to get nutrition into the plant, there has to be bacterial and activity in the soil. There has to be life there. So it has to be soil, not dirt. And in the very same way, our gut has to be live tissue, not toxic junk. And so all of those things go to creating congestion throughout the system. And if fear is the primary mode of operation, or hostility, which is just a drug to anesthetize fear, then there ends up being congestion at these capillary orifices because they're closed down and the flow can't happen. What the AVACEN does is gets the tissue to soften, and flow begins to happen, which cleans out the congestion and the toxicity that's stuck in the tissue. And then when you pour enough heat into the body and the hippocampus says, oh, we're getting too warm, we have to do something, then what happens is the microcirculatory system opens to flush that heat on a whole other level. Now you're pumping blood into the organs, into the muscles, throughout the whole system on a whole other level. There's actually an interesting article if you put in, I believe it was Science magazine. It was published in a couple different magazines, but Loughborough University in England did a study on the benefits of a hot bath. And it's all the same thing. So you can do the same thing with a hot bath with the AVACEN, except that there's one genius piece. The designer of the AVACEN set the machine up so that you don't go into sweat mode. Now, if you go into a hot bath, you warm the blood, It has just, I mean, uncountable benefits. They've done the research, blood sugar, all sorts of things change when you warm the blood. And you can do that with a bath. But when you take a bath, or you can do it with a sauna, if you do some research
Would
on,
that be? Would your body fight to go back to homeostasis if you're in a
well,
bath or in a sauna?
well, that's the thing. The hack that happens with the AVACEN when you open that AVA, when you distend the blood vessels with the vacuum, keeps it open, the blood flows in, but it keeps the body at a lower temperature than sweat. Because when you get in a bath, first of all, it's messy to do. Most people aren't going to do that if they're really in need of support 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. You can do the same thing by going out for a 5-mile run. People who become addicted to running. This is what's happening. This is the change that's happening. But it's pretty sweaty and messy. And the way that the heat, the excess heat, is dissipated when one's in a bath or goes out for a run is the moisture in the skin rises to the surface, and evaporation of that moisture cools the body down. None of that happens with the AVACEN.
Got it.
It's neat. You don't sweat. It's not messy. You can work on your computer for an hour and have your hand in the AVACEN, or you can watch a movie, and you're doing the same thing. But instead of dissipating that heat through sweat, it dissipates it by increasing the circulation to the whole organic structure, including the brain. And so higher cortical functions tend to open. And when one goes into that relaxation response, everything is accelerated in that rest, digest, regenerate, healing mode.
Would the AVACEN do kind of the same thing? Like we talk a lot about sauna use and all of its benefits. Can you get those same exact benefits, maybe even more so, with the AVACEN?
Well, that's what I'm saying. The one thing that was genius of the inventor of the AVACEN was to make sure that the body stays below sweat point. Because when you go into sweat, now you're dissipating the heat through sweat. And that doesn't produce any healing benefit. When all of the heat is being dissipated by microcirculation throughout the body, there's that flush, then every organ is getting a greater blood supply, which means more oxygen, more nutrition, and the activation of the lymphatic system and the removal of wastes. If the heat is dissipated through sweat, you don't get those benefits.
I had no idea that the AVACEN activated the lymphatic system. That makes complete sense.
It's all connected in, and one of the reasons why when people start the AVACEN, especially if they're highly toxic, that we suggest that they start out just doing 5 to 10 minutes for a day or two, is because you can go into a Hertzheimer reaction, go into a detox. And so if people are, pretty toxic, then they want to take it slowly. Not you can do any harm. It's a wonderful thing. It's just not Dr. Feelgood, And
can you actually have like a negative response in a scenario where it's overwhelming? Is that kind of
well? My offering would be it wouldn't be a negative response, but it's called a healing crisis. When you think of the body, a mind unit, as an energy system, if an energy comes in that is of a disintegrative nature, when we go back to Einstein, there's energy, not matter. Relative to this integrated energy system, there are two qualities of energy. There's that which builds it up, integrative energy. There's that which tears it down, disintegrative energy. If you put a disintegrative energy into the structure, you become symptomatic. If that energy is physical, mental, emotional, it might be a toxic emotion. It might be a physical toxin. And on the way in, the body responds to it and it reflects that toxicity. And if this person doesn't have sufficient vitality and strength to throw it off, then it stores it away in tissue, stores it away. People become filled with toxins. The detoxification processes of the structure don't work properly when people live in mode. Shuts it down. So when you become vital enough, I have an imaginary vitality meter, goes from 1 to 10. So imagine that I'm at a level 5 vitality and I have a level 7 toxin. Why am I at a level 5 vitality? I don't want to deal with those level 7 feelings. So I eat all the junk I can. I take a shot of scotch when I need it. Hey, give me some caffeine. Oh, give me some sugar. I need ice cream. Give me something toxic. Or just give me nutrition-free food. And now, when I'm designed to live at a 10, I'll drop down, drop down. The more I toxify, the lower my vitality is. So here I am at a 5, and I've got a level 7 toxin. Maybe it's rage that I need to deal with. When I start changing my diet, and this is one of the reasons, I heard one speaker a few years back say that people will change their religions before they'll change their diet. Why? Because if I start eating actual food, I'm going to strengthen. And if I strengthen and I get up to a level 7.5 vitality, all of a sudden the automatic dissociation mechanism in me says, hey, that old level 7 toxin we couldn't handle 20 years ago, we've not now got the vitality to handle it. Boom, up it comes. Nothing negative about that. That's wonderful. It just isn't Dr. Feelgood. Healing, and the reason why most people want treatment, just treat my symptoms, just shut this down, is because they think they don't have to deal with it. But what they shut down becomes long-term degeneration. What they open up, they're going to go back through physically, mentally, emotionally. So on a physical level, when one becomes vital enough, and what the AVACEN does is it vitalizes, when one becomes vital enough on a physical level, they're going to experience any physical symptom they have ever had in their lives, and there's going to be low energy. They're rocking along, doing great, and all of a sudden they're like, crash, I can hardly move. What's wrong? I'm so tired. Well, tell me, just before you got that tired, had you hit a new level of clarity, a new level? Well, yeah, last night, man, I went to bed feeling so great. I was on top of the world. And then I got up this morning, and I wonder if anybody got the number of the Mack truck that went through my room during the night. What happened? Oh, you just went into a healing crisis. You hit a new level of vitality. Your structure opened what you need to deal with. Now, lay down and let yourself heal. Probably one of the biggest things missing in our culture in terms of people actually healing is we're so go, 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 so driven that people don't stop and go, I need to take time for me. I need to rest. I need to get into the relaxation response and let myself process through this old physical toxicity that I'm moving. I got this gut ache, and man, I remember, man, I was about 7 when I had that happen. God, this feels just like when I was, yeah, it is the actual toxicity that went into the structure at the age of 7. So physically, any kind of physical symptom you've ever had in low energy. Mentally, looks like any negative thought you've ever had in confusion. That's part of the healing process. So now all of a sudden what that 7-year-old was thinking about dad as dad whacked him in the head is now in his mind. But, dad's been dead for 20 years, and he turns around and there's his spouse, and now those thoughts get pointed at his spouse. Now we have conflict in a relationship. There's where the forgiveness piece comes in. Because when you know how to forgive, you start to access those dissociated energies directly, and you start consciously, purposely throwing them out of your structure rather than pointing them at somebody else and blaming somebody else. There's an interesting conversation going on in a lot of the world today about this horrible, satanic one world religion that's trying to take over the world. Excuse me. The one world religion took over the world a long, long time ago, and the religion is called blame. This is all your fault. Look what you've done to me. Yes, I've been through this 87 different times with 42 different people, but this time it really is your fault. And I've been tricked by my own perception. The energies that are moving me, I'm going to turn into a picture. Pardon me. What's it going to be a picture of? Well, let's see. Who's in my environment today? You. Oh, okay. You're the problem. Who was in my environment yesterday? Oh, you. It was Joe that was the problem. Oh, it was Harry. And I have a whole procession of people, and what's going on inside of me is all my fault. That's the one world religion that took over a long time ago. It's called blame and guilt, and it's all your fault. So when one goes into a vitalized state and they understand the healing process, then they know that physically, mentally, and emotionally, and again, emotionally, it's going to look like any kind of negative feeling and depression. So this person that was on top of the world last night gets up in the morning just lower than a snake's belly. What happened? I hit a level of vitality where I could process this deep, dissociated content. And maybe this content isn't even mine. It might go back 4 generations in my bloodline. I might be working with something that happened to my great-great-great-great-grandfather. There's actually we do a radio show 5 days a week, and in our intensive, we did a Zoom intensive, codependence to interdependence. It's something that's available as a self-study if anybody wants to do it. But there was a woman in it who had been, actually, she was in her 70s and heading to the hospital because of some heart issues. And in the intensive, she was given the assignment of inquiring of her generations internally about their heart condition. Well, I'll tell you, this happened live during the intensive, and I was in tears as I'm listening to what this woman went through. And she ended up having what for her was a conversation with, if I remember correctly, it was her great-great-grandfather. And he spoke about how he came over from, I believe it was Lithuania, where they were starving, to this land of milk and honey. And they starved here in America. And he told her about how they actually dug a hole in the ground and created a cave to live in, and how he lived in such terror that his crops would fail and his family would starve, and how the rage he took out on his wife and his children, and how abusive he came. She knew historically that that man existed, and she had a conversation with him. And she was able to process him through as she processed herself through this heart crisis that she had. Just monumental. She actually called into the radio show a couple of days later to share that. And once again, I was in tears with that. I'll send you a link to the radio show where she shares that conversation. And this is a woman who's been doing this, my work now, for 16 or 17 years. So she's developed some skills at doing it. You know, when people first run into it, they go, well, how could I ever do that? I mean, gee, well, like any other skill, if you work with it, you develop a skill. You know, back a few years ago, I bought a computer, and when I got it, it wouldn't work properly. I called the company, and I'm on the phone with tech support for a couple hours, and the company, okay, well, gee, we can't fix it. Send it back to us. So I send it back. They fix it. I bring it back, plug it in. Same problem. Call them again, tech support. Send it back. They fix it. Bring it back. Same thing. Still doesn't work. I have a friend of mine who at that time lived in Kansas City, and he was a former NASA computer scientist. He's got about 4 businesses. I don't bother him because I know how busy he is. But I'm like at my rope's end with this computer. So I called Graham and I said, Graham, I got this computer and, you know, this is what's happening. He says, well, here, go to a C prompt. Back then I was just learning, what's a C prompt? Okay, I go to a C prompt. He says, type the string of characters in, hit a return. Okay, tell me what the screen says. He tells me, or I tell him. He says, okay, type this in, hit a return. Tell me what it says. I do that. Okay, type this in, your computer's fixed. It's like, come on, Graham, now you've got to be kidding. Michael, your computer is fixed. Guess what? My computer was fixed.
Interesting.
Now, former NASA computer scientist, he knew because he had the skills exactly what to do. The average person who's lived in the world religion of blame, everything's your fault, it was dad's fault, it was mom's fault, it's the government's fault, it's the doctor's fault, it's everybody else's fault, starts to recognize, oh, my perceptual constructs show me pictures, false pictures of everybody else. But what they really tell me about first is the content of my own mind. Now I start to develop the skill of going into my own mind and cleaning up what never belonged. And I start to change the energetic patterns, the toxic energies, and I begin to work through them. And if I have a physiological support like the AVACEN that vitalizes and helps to, on a physiological level, crack up those toxic deposits of energy, those swamps within the microcirculatory system. And, you know, we hear a lot from medicine about, you know, arteries and veins, but we rarely ever hear about these tiny, tiny blood vessels that are 1/10 to 100th the thickness of a hair. Because what do you do with those? Who knows how to do anything with those? Well, the AVACEN does, and it works on that level. And, you know, an artery or a vein never supplied a drop of blood to a cell, never supplied a 1 iota of oxygen or 1 scintilla of nutrition to a cell. It all gets delivered to the capillary. The capillary delivers it to the cell. And then that blood flow removes the toxic wastes of metabolism that aren't supposed to stay in the cell and toxify the cell. They're supposed to be carried out. But if the headwaters, if that capillary orifice is closed off, that doesn't happen. And the cell now starts to become a swamp on its own. And when it becomes a swamp, there's an environment there. There's an old saying that says, if you feed them, they will come. And that toxic waste becomes the perfect supply for toxic elements, toxic bacteria and such. And the bacteria isn't the problem. The bacteria has always been there, and it's always been in balance by, balanced by a healthy cell and an immune system. It starts to get a little out of balance, the immune system kicks in. But if it's way out of balance because there isn't that blood flow into the cell, if there isn't the oxygen nutrition and the cell turns toxic, then the waste it just exacerbates and ultimately leads to death.
So, what does this? I want to get this in here because I know a lot of people who are listening, know people with arthritis or have arthritis themselves. How does this make sense with arthritis? And because I know my mom uses this for that purpose. And then once we get through the arthritis thing, talk to us a little bit about best practices for introducing AVACEN into your routine.
Okay. Well, are you familiar with the work of a man named Dr. John Sarno?
I'm not.
Okay. Well, you can go to Amazon.
Okay.
Type in the name of the documentary on his work, okay. All the Rage. And for $5, you can watch his video.
Okay.
Or go to a website, All the Rage, DOC, as in documentary, all the rage, all one word, .com. And for $6, you can buy the link to Vimeo and watch his video. Dr. Sarno passed a couple of years ago at the age of 92. He was a medical researcher at, I believe it was University of Buffalo or New York University, Rusk School of Medicine. And he was a back surgeon. And in the later years of his practice, he did no back surgery. What he did was he taught people what the cause of their pain was. And he has the best definition of back pain, or any form of pain that I've ever heard, but especially for him specifically because he was a spinal surgeon. His definition of back pain was back pain is unconscious rage. It's rage that people have dissociated from. And what he says is, he has a thing called TMS, tension mitosis syndrome. He says this is totally, completely caused by the mind, but it is a totally, completely physical disorder.
Yep.
Now, a lot of people want to try and figure that one out. Like, wait a minute, there's a mind and there's a body. But, we've been tricked. Way back in history, the church and the scientists made a deal. You do the mind, we'll do the body, we'll do the soul. And, so they separated it. But the mind can no more be separated from the body than I use an example of. So I have a silver dollar, and I look at one side of the silver dollar and I see the head. It's George Washington or whoever it is. On the other side, I see a building. And so I say, so here's the tail and here's the head. All right. So now I want you to take the tail off the coin. Can you take the tail off the coin and leave only the head? No. The tail and the head are different perspectives on a single event. That's silver dollar. You can't separate them. The mind and the body are different perspectives on a single event called the human energy system. When a disintegrative energy comes into the mind, and cell biologist Bruce Lipton is showing us in the lab that when you think a thought, that thought produces a neuropeptide molecule. An actual molecule appears out of nowhere, and it circulates around in the structure until it finds a receptor site in a cell that matches. That neuropeptide lands on the cell. And if we were looking from the inside of the cell, we would see as that neuropeptide integrates into the cell, we'd see what we call chemistry. Now the cell chemistry is changed by the neuropeptide, which is a result of the thought we thought. The body and the mind are one. Mm-hmm. Put disease into the mind, you have actual physical disease. Have physical disease in the body, you have actual disease in the mind. Mm. So what Dr. Sarno explains to his patients, and I've watched people with severe forms of pain, in the middle of watching his video, go, oh my God, that's what my pain is. And I'm talking about people who've been laid up in bed for months with excruciating back pain. that have their back pain disappear that fast.
There is a book that I was referred to recently. I have not read it yet, but my buddy gave me kind of the premise, and it might be related to Dr. Sarno. I'm not exactly sure, but it's in regards to back pain, and it's by a doctor, and the way he describes back pain is, well, kind of a little synopsis of the book is a lot of times, or where he's coming from is he's saying that your brain will distract yourself from some sort of traumatic event with
That's Sarno.
with a pain.
Yeah.
So like if you're having back pain, your brain doesn't want you to deal with whatever traumatic thing is because it's trying to protect you. And so it distracts you with a pain in your back. Is that Sarna?
That's Sarno. That's Sarno. And the mechanism, TMS, here's what he says. He says, so your mind doesn't want to deal with that, so it creates tension mitosis syndrome, he calls it. It creates tension in the muscle, in the capillary, and that restricts blood supply. He says a 5% lack of oxygen in a cell, and the cell is now in excruciating pain.
Wow.
So it's a physical thing that's happening.
Right.
The tension restricts blood flow. Exactly what we're talking about that the AVACEN counteracts is it goes in and softens that tension and increases the blood flow into the cell. Again, according to Sarno, 5% lack of oxygen, and you've got excruciating pain in the cell. And it's done with the mind, but it happens in the body because they are the head and the tail. You can't take the tail off of the coin. You can't take the head off of the coin and leave just the tail. You can't take the mind out of the body, and you can't take the body out of the mind. When we put in it's interesting. If you go to the opening words, this goes back now to ancient times, go to the opening words in the book of John in the New Testament, and we're told it says that it opens with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. Not what it says in Aramaic. What it says in the original language that was written in the beginning was the mind energy, and the mind energy became flesh. Think of thought, neuropeptide, land on cell, becomes chemistry in cell. Forgiveness, develop the skill, reverse the religion of denial. No, I'm not dealing with that. Charlie did that to me. It's all his fault. Reverse that, develop the skill to go in and literally extract that neuropeptide, decode what it says, and now you're in touch with the compressed energy that was locked into that cell, creating trauma. You're in touch with it, and now you're dealing with the original event. And what happens, in order to heal anything, you've got to return your mind to the point where the original trauma happened. Now, a lot of people think, well, does that mean I have to lay on the couch for 20 years and find the deep, dark, dirty thing that happened to me? No, you don't have to do that at all. Returning to the point where the event happened is not a function of memory. Returning to the point where it happened is a function of forgiveness. So something comes along that resonates, that experience I had at 7 when I was being beaten by Dad. That energy resonates in me, and I produce a construct about my spouse made out of that mind energy. And now my spouse is the enemy that my father was, decades ago. And that picture, if I can collapse it, if I know how it is developed, and it's developed, if you remember from our conversation last time on forgiveness, we have a goal. Nobody's ever upset with people who are fulfilling all the goals that they have for them. You're doing all the things I want you to do. Hey, I'm a happy camper with you, unless I'm just a generally miserable person. But the minute you violate a goal that I hold, the goal is the driver that determines, out of the 20,000 bits or the 10,000 bits of data that they could measure at Harvard, firing in the mind where only 9 bits show up. The goal is the thing that determines which 9 bits of data my mind is allowed to use. If I know that, and I apply forgiveness. In the Aramaic, the word forgive is shabag, it means to cancel. When I cancel that goal, my perceptual construct collapses. And when it collapses in on itself. And when it collapses in on itself, I've got access to what underlies it, what the original event was. I just returned my mind to the place where the original trauma happened. Now, that doesn't usually happen all at one time as people start to do the work of forgiveness, because they don't want to go there. They've lived their whole lives in denial, dissociation, projection. It's all everybody else's fault. It takes time, like my friend Graham, who told me, bing, 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 here's how to fix your computer. It takes the skill. And by working with your own mind and cleaning it up, you develop the skill of being able to access those things. And the AVACEN vitalizes to keep vitality up, keep blood flow going, so that you can process through those things. And in this work, we define processing as the ability to hold love conscious, active, and present when something less than love comes up. So when one accesses those pained events in one's lives, or in one's life, then they are able to bring those things forward and maintain the presence of active love.
Well, that would be the canceling function, right?
Well, when you cancel the goal, the perceptual construct collapses in on itself. Now, going to the root of what happened, you start to access the original mind energy. And when you hold love present for that, that light dissolves the traumatic aspect of it, and the trauma is healed. So all of those things have to come together simultaneously, and that's why it's a skill. And that's why most people, when they first hear about forgiveness, don't really hang around long enough to really understand the process. Actually, we've done, since we talked, I'll send you a link to this too. Maybe you can put it on with this video.
For sure.
We have an app, a forgiveness app, the world's only forgiveness app. People can go to their app store on their phone and just type in the words Heartland, Heartland, Aramaic forgiveness, and they'll be looking at the world's only forgiveness app. It's free. It's totally, completely private. It was specifically designed with as few permissions as we could possibly ask for. The average app, they want your grandmother's social security number. They want to access your contacts, use your phone, send your text. This only asks for one thing, that is, need to use the internet in order to operate. And then when you do the forgiveness process, there's a worksheet you can actually fill out. Then you do the forgiveness process. You can save it as a PDF. It'll ask permission to save that. That's the only two permissions it asks for. When people get into this kind of work, it's pretty intensely private. And so we made the app so it's totally private. So anyway, we did a video that walks people through how to use the app. So I'll send you that video so people can just go click and walk through it. And of course, 5 days a week from 1 till 2 o'clock, we have an internet radio show. You can access it through our website, which is whyagain.org. People can go there. There's a microphone. You can click it and listen to the radio show there. Most people actually call into the show with their phones, and the call-in number for the show is 563-999-3581. If you call that number, 563-999-3581, you'll be listening to the show live from 1 till 2 o'clock Eastern time. And if you have a question, just push one on your phone, and we're having a conversation, and we'll answer any questions you have about the AVACEN or forgiveness or any of the corollary work that we've developed over the last 50 years. We've just kind of given a little window on the whole thing here, but
yeah, I'd encourage anybody to go check not only whyagain.org, but also listen into the show. Dr. Ryce, you've been doing that for how many years? You just said
we've got over 4,000 hours in the archives now. We've been doing it 5 days a week for 11 years, 52 weeks a year.
So amazing.
And the conversation goes on, and the most people can't access this kind of thinking anywhere in their world.
Yeah,
and if you can't access, when you think of the massive data, if we took all of the world's cray supercomputers and wired them together, it would not approximate the data processing and carrying capacity of one human form. Wouldn't even come close. So in order, and there's a physics principle behind the way this thing works. It's called inertia. If you remember from physics class in high school, a body moving in a particular direction at a particular rate of speed will tend to continue to move in that direction at that rate of speed until it's acted upon by an outside force. We have a massive data that is generations upon generations upon generations. In fact, if you go back, there's a story about this in the Old Testament where this group of people called the Jews were lost in the desert, they say, for 40 years. Now, when you think about that, and I think we talked about this in our last show, but when you think about that, so here's a group of very bright people who understand astronomy very well, and they're lost in a 35 square mile area for 40 years. Does that make any sense? I mean, they know where the sun comes up and where the sun sets. If you follow it, you're out of the desert, out of 35 square miles in a matter of days. But that word desert is a code word for the unconscious. And if you go read that story, you'll find out the way they got out of the desert, what had to happen. They said the old generation had to die off. That didn't mean everybody in old physical bodies had to physically die. The root of the word generation is genari. It means cause. All of the old causes dissociated from and locked in this carbon-based memory system, which was called the mind of man in those teachings. All of those old dynamics are inertia-bound, man. They're going to keep going until you develop the strength and the skill and the willingness to deal with that, dig into it and change it. People are driven by what's ever contained within their unconscious. And the code word in that ancient teaching was the desert. It was also another code word in those ancient teachings for the desert was the heart. And you remember they said, take care of the heart, for out of it are the issues in life. The issues in your life aren't about your dad or your mom or the guy over there or the gal over there or the child that, just got mad at you. The issues in your life come from your own heart, your own unconscious. Forgiveness gives you access to your unconscious. Most people don't want to go there. The world so didn't want to go there that the Greeks took the teaching on forgiveness, which was all about how you go inside and remove content that never belonged, and made it about how, it's all their fault. Here's the one world religion to blame. It's their fault, but you just forgive them. You just let them off the hook for what's happening inside of you. Then life will get better. And that's a total fraud. Like, never, ever forgive anybody for anything, but forgive continuously, which means continuously go inside yourself for the generational patterns of hostility or fear that need to be removed. Remove them, and now you're freed from the desert. What happens then? You get to go to the promised land. What's the promised land? It's just the land of conscious co-creation. Instead of unconsciously creating what happens in your life and asking yourself the question of my book, why is this happening to me again? You consciously create your life. You engage in what you really want to be creating, not I think about, I want a wonderful relationship, but in the file in my unconscious on relationships is relationships are strife and conflict and fight and death and suffering. Guess what kind of relationship I'm going to get out of my request for a wonderful relationship? I'm going to get what's in my heart. Take care of the heart, for out of it are the issues in life. It's not out of the marriage, it's out of the heart. And so to enter into the habit of owning and processing through what never belonged, and the blessing of the AVACEN, I use it about 2.5 hours a day personally. I started out using about 10 minutes twice a day, then worked to 15 minutes twice a day, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And if I don't get into a healing crisis, it's too much for me, keep increasing the time. I have one friend in...
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah. Start out slow.
Okay.
Because we detailed what a healing crisis looks like, physically, mentally, emotionally. If you go in too fast, if you're really toxic and you go in too fast, you can have so much moving. It's like overwhelm, and it's too traumatic. If you're carrying a lot of trauma and you start to detox your trauma too quickly, it can be a problem. So you start slowly, 10 minutes, morning and night.
Does it matter which hand?
Some people use the left hand in the morning, the right hand at night. I haven't found it makes a difference.
Okay. So you can't overdo it on a hand.
No. Well, I was starting to say I have a friend in Arizona who had several back surgeries. He had actually had a couple of surgeries where they cut nerves to try and deaden his pain. He was in so much pain. His mother lived in California. He had not seen her in several years. He couldn't get in a car and drive. He started using the AVACEN, and after about 6 months, he was up to using it 6 hours a day. And he was able to get in his car, drive to California, see his mom, and drive back home again without so much trauma that he couldn't do it. It took about 6 months, but he was doing 6 hours a day. I do about 2.5 hours a day, but I suggest people work up slowly to it. Add 5 minutes twice a day. When you get to 30 minutes twice a day, then if you want to, increase and go to a second session. Do 60 minutes.
Is there certain results you're looking at in terms of like gauging, you know, when to like, what if I get up to 30 minutes twice a day and I'm like pretty happy? I'm like, you know, this is really, you know, my pain is subsiding. Would you just suggest stay there?
Stay with it.
Okay.
Stay with it. Or the best guide is always your own guidance. Listen to your own guidance. What are you being told? There is a part of you that knows everything that you need. And at first, while we're living in this little perceptual bubble, it can be hard to get guidance from that. But as you start to soften that with forgiveness, as you start to break through the toxicity, you'll learn more and more what's required. Generally, you know, when I first started using it, I had an injury. There's a family dynamic. I had a grandmother who, on her deathbed, you know, they had taken the parts of her feet and her legs off till she was both up to both her knees. My mother had horribly deformed feet, and I had some pretty deep trauma with my feet. And I had a tingling in the tips of all 10 of my toes when I first started to use the AVACEN. I thought it was nerve damage. It's just, you know, it's a family thing. It's what you live with. The second time I used the AVACEN, 80% of that was gone.
Wow.
And within 2 months, 100% of that was gone. So my routine now, usually in the morning, I do about an hour meditation, my hand's in the AVACEN. I do my radio show for an hour. My hand is always in the AVACEN when I'm doing the radio show. And in the evening, my wife and I have a TV in our bedroom, and we usually watch a movie or something. And we'll each do at least a half an hour with the AVACEN last thing night before we go to sleep. One of the other reports that I get regularly from people was, I thought I slept well, but man, now I really sleep well. And so I suggest, no, last thing at night, you know, have the AVACEN on. People who wake up a lot during the night, keep the AVACEN on the bed beside you, keep it in standby mode. And if you wake up, put your hand in the AVACEN. People go right back to sleep. And there are two ways to turn the machine on if you're not aware of it. One, you can hit the power button, it turns on, you do a session, and it automatically powers down when you complete that session. Or you notice on the right-hand side, there's a button with a check mark on it. You push the check mark, and then you push the power button, hold them both down, and let them go at the same time. Now, when the machine powers up and you do a session, when you finish the session, it goes into standby mode. So you don't have to wait for the machine to heat up every time.
Ooh, okay.
So you just, and it takes, you know, 3 or 4 cents a day to run it. So it's not any big deal. My machine is on all day, every day. At night, it lays beside the bed. And last thing at night, we use it on the bed and then shut it down and then start it again in the morning.
Is that something like, say you've gotten, you know, to a place where you feel really good, a lot of your, you know, aches and pains are gone. Should you stop, or you know, do you just keep going? Does it last forever even if you don't continue doing it?
The people who I've worked with who have stopped using it, I've had, like, I think about one woman, and she had, you mentioned arthritis. She had arthritis in her finger so bad she had to wear a splint, and she'd had the splint on for a couple of years. She used the AVACEN for a week, and she threw away her splint, and she never put the splint back on again. She actually had borrowed, I loaned her the AVACEN, and she had it for a couple of weeks, eliminated that, and she just stopped using it. And her fingers never gone back to that state. And other people I've seen, you know, they haven't changed the toxic ways of thinking, the toxic food, the toxic ways of behaving. So if they drop their maintenance program, they'll tend to slide back. So, like, for me personally, I intend to use it every day for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, it's part of my daily routine. It's like my nutrition. That boost in vitality, I feel, you know, over the period of about 2.5 years I've been using it, I've just watched several things that I would call the symptoms of aging that have just dropped away. You know, when my daughter was born, she's now 40. She doesn't like me to say that, but 40 years ago, she was born. And right across from where we lived in Atlanta, there was a large treed lot. And a developer had bought it. And the week she was born, they started cutting it down to put them all in. And we had a fireplace, so they were just hauling this wood away. And I got talking to the supervisors. Yeah, we just haul it to the dump and burn it. It's like, well, do you mind if I cut some of it for my fire? And he said, take as much as you want. Then I don't have to haul it. And I got myself a big, hefty chainsaw. And I cut about 14 cords of wood in a period of about 10 or 12 days. Well, I wasn't in shape to handle a chainsaw and cut 14 cords of wood. And I had a pain in my spine, right, you know, where you grip your hand, where it tightens in the spine. And I thought I'd done nerve damage because from the time my daughter was born, I had pain in that area of my spine. It wasn't terrible. It was just always there. And well, I did some nerve damage. I overdid the, vibrating chainsaw. And about 4 months into using the AVACEN, I got my hand in the AVACEN and I feel this sensation in that spot in my back, and pain that had been there for 40 years was 100% gone.
That's wild.
My trauma in life, the thing that drove me to move into the arena of healing, my original work was in electronics with a side study in physics. I was an electronic technician, but my mother had toxemia the last 6 days before I was born, and they gave her Pitocin to try to get me out. And that led to them calling my father and saying, if you want to see this kid alive, you better get down to the hospital because he's not going to make it through the night. And I was almost dead 3 or 4 times the first year of my life. The first 2 weeks of school, I was never in school. I was in an oxygen tent in the hospital with lung problems. I came to the point where I recognized that the drugs they were giving me were keeping me alive, but they were killing me. Every drug's a disease disguised as a cure. So that set me on a path of healing. That's what led me into this whole, healing mode. But about the 6-month point, I've got my hand in the AVACEN one morning and I take a breath and it's like, oh my God, this is the first breath I have taken in my life. And my lungs have changed. There has always been a wheeze in my lungs my whole life until last December when I got COVID. Now, with my lung history and my so-called age, I should have been dead from COVID. The 4th day of COVID was the last time I had a wheeze in my lungs, and my lungs have worked better than they have worked in my whole life. COVID was a gift for me. And I had my hand in the AVACEN for hours every day. And there's no wheeze in my lungs since the 4th day I had COVID.
That is wild.
COVID's a microcirculatory disorder. That's why you hear about the person who lost a leg. Another person had brain problems. Another person had this and that. It's all about circulation. And what the AVACEN's designed to do is to restore circulation. Reports we're getting are that people who get COVID do not have long COVID if they're using the AVACEN.
That's interesting.
You got to keep the oxygen moving into the cell. You've got to you got to eat the nutrition. You got to start with the soil. You got to eat nutrition. Then the nutrition has to get into the cell in order for the cell to function properly. And the cell needs to be able to detoxify itself and have a pathway to get rid of its waste. And that's what the AVACEN opens up on a physiological level. So to me, what I see the AVACEN is, my specialty being first century Aramaic forgiveness, to me, the AVACEN is physical forgiveness. When you think of forgiveness as removal of what never belonged, the AVACEN is physical removal of what never belonged.
I love that. Dr. Ryce, I know we got to get going here. You got your radio show here shortly. Can you tell everybody where they can find you? You've mentioned your website. Go ahead and tell us again about whyagain.org and where everybody can find you.
Sure. Yeah, if you go to whyagain.org, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a link that says Start Here. Click the Start Here button. The first video is a video on how to navigate the website. Our website is huge. It's over 20,000 pages. I don't know how it's growing that large, but that's what it is. So my wife has done a video, and a woman, we do a book study with a book study club in London, England. So a woman in London and my wife did a video on navigating the website, how to find what there is, because there's just so much there, so many resources. And then the second video is a video on how to use the app. The app, you can do the forgiveness work there. There's a kids game for introducing kids to this type of thinking and to forgiveness. There's access to many of the tools. If you have a question, if you're using the worksheet process that we have, you can click a button right on any page of the app and send us a question directly. We'll read that question on a radio show, answer it, send you back an email and let you know when we answered it, give you a link to that show. So we're here to support. People can call into the radio show 5 days a week from noon to 2 o'clock. The radio show is called Mind Shifters Radio. It's on Blog Talk Radio. And the first several years, it was myself, and there was a psychologist who was doing this work out of Chicago, and he's been doing the work for about 17 or 18 years, and he would listen to the show, and we'd talk, and he actually became a co-host. And then about going on 3 years ago now, Dr. Tim Hayes, who's a clinical psychologist, said, Michael, I'm ready to do my own show. And so from noon to 1 o'clock Eastern time, you'll hear Dr. Tim Hayes, who has a perspective on this work and forgiveness. And then from 1 till 2 o'clock, you'll be with Jeannie and I. And you can, if you go to the microphone on the website, you can drill down and you can listen to the archives of over 4,000 hours. If you click on the book cover of Why Is This Happening to Me Again, you can download it in any one of, I forget now exactly how many, 8 or 9 different languages.
That's amazing.
And you can do the worksheet process on the website live. You can download the worksheets so you can print them. You can do them live on your phone with the app, print them as a PDF within your phone. And any support we can give you, or any ideas you have of how we can support you that we're not doing it yet. We're always creating new mechanisms. And our ultimate goal literally is to deliver first century Aramaic forgiveness and this understanding to every mind, heart, and being on the planet.
I love it, Dr. Ryce.
Anytime you want to get together, anytime you've got an opening in your schedule, hey, call Michael. Let's have another conversation, because we can do this for months.
And we could just keep going and going. And I tell you what, Dr. Ryce, I'm going to take you up on that. So guys in the audience, you're going to be seeing more of Dr. Ryce here on the show. Man, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Absolutely honored and delighted.
All right, guys, thank you so much for checking out this episode of Outside the Box with Dr. Michael Ryce. We'll put all the links that we talked about during the show in the description below. And as always, we'll see you guys next time.
Appreciate you doing what you do, man. Blessings.
Thanks, Dr. Ryce.
Bye-bye.